In Module 3, we're going to consider the different ways in which education research has been approached over the past century, and the philosophical and theoretical undercurrents that have supported changing approaches to educational research. I'm going to do a preamble first, and then I'm going to divide the rest of the video into two sections because I apologize, but the length of this is going to be much longer than many of the other videos, just because the content is so demanding. And I wanted to be sure to cover some of the territory. So those divisions I'll indicate with a particular slide and note it in my verbal commentary as well. So you can stop there and come back to it if you wish, so that you'll have continuity at least within those particular sections. The second thing is I'd like to apologize for my voice. This is the remnants of a cold that everybody in the world seems to have right now, and so I may stop every once in a while for a sip of tea just to keep me going, but I do apologize for its raspiness, and I hope that it won't be too irritating for you to listen to. All right, let's go. Before we get going too far, however, I'd like to talk a bit about the assignments coming up during this module. First is the reflection forum, which you're well aware of, and the only difference with this one is that responses to your colleagues are not going to be required. So I'll be marking only your initial response to the question that's raised for you to respond to based on the readings. Your responses to your colleagues are certainly welcome, and you may just feel like compelled that you must respond to something that one of your colleagues has said, and that's absolutely fine, and that in fact it's wonderful. But we're trying to kind of save you a bit of time because this module is rather busy due to the annotated bibliography assignment. So I'll turn to that next. The annotated bibliography assignment is divided into two sections. In this first section that we're going to be doing in this module, you'll look for 5 articles, and only one can be from a professional journal, which you're now going to be very familiar with in terms of the differentiation between professional journals and academic journals. So only one may be from a professional journal, the rest need to be from academic peer-reviewed journals. There are many formats for annotated bibliographies, and you may have done it differently in another course, and that's absolutely fine because there are many ways in which you can approach this particular way of annotating readings that you've become aware of. But this one is meant to mimic a strategy you're likely to use in your own research. That is, each one will provide a snapshot of one of the many, many articles you're likely to explore as you're doing your research project. In order for this assignment to be useful, then, you will need a complete reference to the article using APA 6th edition. That will be very handy for you when you're doing your reference list at the end of your project and so on. A brief idea of the key concepts in the article as they apply to the particular article that you're reviewing, including the research approach, methodology, and conclusion, and particularly how it's linked to your area of inquiry. The whole set of annotations are then arranged alphabetically by author and are a maximum of 5 pages, including the title page, double-spaced 12-point font, and so on. So this is a great opportunity for you to begin to explore the literature around a particular area of interest for your own research projects. So it's worth spending some time looking at and curating your list to reflect the best you can find in your library searches and so on related to the particular interest that you have, or it might be a range of interests, but you are focusing on one. Note as well that any other readings you might like to explore for the next part of this assignment in Part B should be kept perhaps in a separate file of some kind so that you then don't lose that information. You can go back to it and use it again for either the assignment and or your own research project later on. Your readings this week will include some videos that provide frameworks for considering various approaches to research, the Robertson videos, and the Ryan reading is very useful in unpacking the ideas that we're going to be talking about in more detail in this video from Guba and Lincoln, but in more accessible language. And so, as you're reading Guba and Lincoln, don't become discouraged because all of us including me, reading this article, may find a thesaurus or Google very handy in kind of getting at some of the key concepts that they're looking at, because they're using philosophical language that not all of us are completely familiar with. But as you can see, the emphasis in this module is on key philosophical concepts that shape research approaches, why it's important to understand them, and how they might relate to the kind of questions of primary concern in educational research. I'm going to spend most of my time on the Guba and Lincoln paper, as it is by far the most complex and is a base for understanding more deeply the other papers and videos and other concepts that you'll come across in your readings in this course and in others. Ivana Lincoln and Egan Guba are preeminent scholars in the area of qualitative research, articulating its ontology, epistemology, and methodology with a strong understanding of its philosophical roots. When Guba died in 2008, he was mourned and remembered for his humor, mentorship, and strong support and advocacy for a paradigm shift that has come to be, if not the dominant one, certainly a very important one in educational research for the last several years. Ivana Lincoln is equally well known for her strong scholarship and articulation of what they call naturalistic inquiry that comes under the umbrella of qualitative research. She has written many scholarly books and articles on her own, and has written for many years with Norman Denzin as well, who is one of the co-authors of the handbook from which this article was taken. So in this next section of the video, we're going to be looking at some of the terminology that's important to your own work, as well as to understanding the papers that you're going to be reading. Ryan's going to introduce many of the terms you will encounter in all of the readings and videos, and so for that reason, it's a very helpful one. But I want to explore three concepts in particular first before we dive into Guba and Lincoln in this video. The first is ontology, which considers the nature of being and what things are, or the thing itself. Now, what do we mean by the thing itself, or the nature of being? Well, ontology is interested in what is the essence of the thing under examination, or what is the nature of its reality. For example, we might consider an object such as a table. We can touch it, we can feel it, we can enumerate its properties, and we can be confident that those properties will not change if we're not there. However, the ontology of concepts such as thinking, learning, memory, love, etc., are more problematic. How do we come to an understanding of the thing itself when it's not available for physical examination? What is the nature of something that is more nebulous in nature? Is it knowable at all? And yet it's very important for us to be able to understand that, because so much of what's important in education is ontological in nature. Epistemology, to some degree, comes to the rescue in that it is the study of the nature of knowledge itself, and it helps us to justify our belief so that we know what we think we know. It is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief in X, Y, Z, whatever it happens to be, from opinion about X, Y, or Z. That is, what constitutes valid knowledge? What can be known, and therefore, who is a knower? And that becomes a ethical question as well. In academic work, unlike some, but not all domains in our lives, there is an emphasis on justifying a claim that we make through citing recognized experts in that field of study, providing information about the source of that claim through our own research that has been properly vetted, and so on. Personal experience may be problematic if it cannot be verified through acceptable proofs, and yet so often we depend on our own personal experience when we're talking to someone else about a particular phenomenon. And that personal experience and how we understand it comes through our own worldview and so on. So legitimate information provides confirmation that we know what we think we know, unlike opinion. That does not mean that opinion isn't important, but it is a different kind of knowledge. Last is methodology, which is the systematic theoretical analysis of the methods applied to a field of study. For those of us doing research, there is a necessity to go through the process of choosing a theoretical approach to your research and then thinking through and presenting that theoretical approach and your rationale for its choice in light of your research question and reflected in the methods that you use. The next term, and one of the key terms that Guba and Lincoln consider, is the notion of paradigm. And they see it as an umbrella or overarching concept that encompasses ontology, epistemology, and methodology. A paradigm is a distinct set of concepts and thought patterns that guides the choices we make and what is accepted as credible. In the context of research, a paradigm is often highly related to the researcher's basic belief system or worldview that guides the choices made by them because of their fundamental beliefs and values about research, about knowledge, and about the phenomenon under investigation, and the ontology and epistemology from which those choices spring. A paradigm then encompasses the theories and research methods as well as the postulates or claims made by the researcher and the standards by which the validity of that research is judged. In research, the dominant paradigm then includes the convictions and beliefs of the discipline for what constitutes acceptable research. So, for example, if I'm submitting a research to a journal and I were to, for example, submit an article about a feminist examination of equity in higher education, and I submitted that to a psychological journal, which tends to have a much more positivist or quantitative approach to the research that they do, then the kinds of standards that constitute legitimate contributions would be very different, and my manuscript would no doubt be set aside, both because of the topic I'm exploring and the way in which I'm exploring it. So a paradigm then sets up these acceptable theories, research methods, and standards for what constitutes legitimacy within a particular field. Thomas Kuhn wrote about this phenomenon in 1962, which is telling because, of course, this was a time of social unrest and, tremendous questioning of the social, political, and economic status quo. He was writing from within the context of what we might call the hard sciences, where many of the conventions were actually being questioned during this time. As he observed this phenomenon in science, he appropriated an old term, paradigm, meaning example, model, or pattern, and devised the term paradigm shift. That is, the accepted norm, model, or pattern had shifted or changed. Of course, the word paradigm and paradigm shift have been taken up by popular culture, and the meaning has become somewhat obscured now, unfortunately, but Kuhn's concept has been very important in understanding how these kinds of shifts in how we understand the world around us occur over time in the study and understanding of natural and social phenomena. And what he writes about is very important in thinking about how these actual shifts occur. For example, they don't happen in a linear, continuous way. In fact, they may happen geographically. So, for example, the UK and Australia were much more accepting of interpretivist kinds of inquiry at a time when Canada and the United States were still heavily situated in positivist kinds of research approaches to educational research. So it might be geographic, it might even be institutional, and so on. you go to a conference and you hear a new way of approaching something, and suddenly you begin to think differently about the kind of work that you're doing as well. So this happens unevenly and over time and over place in very interesting but non-continuous ways. When these shifts start to occur, they open up new ways of thinking about the phenomena under examination. And so we see new approaches to research beginning to open up. The validity is questioned, accepted, or rejected by consensus over time of the particular academic community. So for example, in my case, in educational administration, I started studying educational administration in 1992. And in 1992, the highly dominant paradigm was quantitative analysis. I, however, crazy or not, wanted to approach it in quite a different way. But the validity of what I was doing was I had to fight for it to be accepted. I had to prove my case to a much higher degree than my colleagues who were doing the more accepted approach. Because the belief was that these competing paradigms were incommensurable and therefore I should step away from it. It was not appropriate within my disciplinary structure. Now, a more contemporary, well, a less contemporary example, I suppose, but an important one in the area of leadership studies is Tom Greenfield and what's become known as the Greenfield-Griffiths debate. In 1974, Tom Greenfield presented a paper in Bristol, and there was a huge ado about it. And the background was that, in fact, Greenfield was well known within the field, both nationally and internationally, as a quantitative analyst. He was hired by boards to do quantitative analysis because he was very good at it. However, he began to question some of the problems that Gu Wenlin can talk about later on in this video, and he went off on a sabbatical, studied the Romance philosophers, and these Romance philosophers were those who led to a more interpretivist approach to educational research, and he began to ask questions like, how might we understand the role of the principal? What is the essence of the role of a principal? You can see that the movement is away from a more epistemological approach to an ontological approach. What's the role of power in organizations, and how can we understand that role better, particularly when there's different cultural groups involved, that sort of thing. Some of the titles of his paper demonstrate a road that he was traveling that was very different than other papers that you might read at the time. One was called Organizations as Social Inventions. Another was called Against Group Mind, an anarchistic theory of organization. And my favorite is The Man Who Came Back Through the Door in the Wall, Discovering Truths, Discovering Self, and Discovering Organizations. And that debate between Greenfield and Griffiths, which was a explosive one, almost literally, went on for well over a decade. It was still going on in 1992 when I took up my own studies. And it wasn't until about 1994 that one of the other, significant thinkers in educational administration and leadership, Thomas Sergiovanni, said in one of his papers, and I had to photocopy this and give it to one of my professors who didn't believe me when I told him I had read this, that Greenfield might have been right. And so that signaled a shift, a paradigmatic shift in the whole field. But it's an interesting example of what Kuhn is talking about. All right, I'm going to go on now to the key ideas in Gu Wenlin, and this will be by far the longest part of this video. So you may want to switch off at this point and then come back to it, or you may want to carry on. I'll probably take another 10 minutes or so to go through this. Really, until the early 1990s in education research, the predominant methodological approach was positivist, scientific, quantitative. especially empiricist would be another word that could be used, especially in departments of educational administration and psychology. There had been rumblings in curriculum studies for a while, and they became more and more open as they became more and more open to qualitative post-positivist research. But admin hung tough until almost the end of the 1990s. And it was during this time that I was doing my master's, as I said, and then my PhD. I decided during this time, in a kind of moment of insanity, I think, to do my work using interpretive and critical qualitative approaches and feminist approaches as well, and found myself experiencing exactly what Kuhn talks about. This is why Guba and Lincoln's work was considered so revolutionary at the time. While there were people doing qualitative work, there hadn't been a rigorous philosophical examination of this shift and its worth in educational research until their study was published in 1994. Their work helped in validating new approaches to educational research, and it's still considered helpful. So it's well worth your time, because many papers that I've read and doctoral theses that I've read and so on use Guba and Lincoln and this particular article to justify the approach that they're using. In their paper, they consider the movement from quantitative to qualitative research and the merits and challenges of each. As they argue, the quantitative paradigm was dominant at the time and had been for some time, as education research, a relatively new field of study in academia, was fighting to prove its validity in a sea of social science disciplines where the quantitative paradigm was dominant. As a result, the quantitative paradigm provided stature and acceptance for them as they found their place within the social sciences. Okay, I'm going to move along fairly quickly from this point, and I'm not going to touch on everything in Guba and Lincoln, you'll be happy to know, but just some of the key points, and provide a bit of an outline or skeleton of the arguments that they present. As already mentioned, quantitative research was, and in some ways still is, the dominant form of inquiry in the physical and social sciences, including education. Sorry, I should rephrase that. It's the dominant form of inquiry. Well, I guess in both, including education, particularly in influential fields of study like educational psychology. However, as a new paradigm began to emerge, not surprisingly, critiques emerged as well. Ryan goes into this in some detail in her paper as well, so you can read both and kind of see how this evolves. The internal critiques began to emerge much more quickly, and they looked at, for example, context, what they called context stripping in quantitative research, and argued that context is in fact central to many of the most important questions in education. And unlike quantitative research that set itself apart from the context, that it had to be a part of any theoretical position taken by educational researchers. Otherwise, meaning and purpose was stripped away as well. For example, as you remember, Hostetler reinforces this critique when he argues that good research is research that works to improve the human condition, and that human condition is context specific. Further, the conclusions of quantitative research were meant to be generally applicable, whereas many education issues were context, and that discovery rather than prediction, that is, an hypothesis that may be proven or disproven in quantitative research, was essential in studying unpredictable environments and people that we couldn't hypothesize initially about. External critiques followed on the internal critiques, and Guba and Lincoln argue that they were the tipping point for paradigm change as the critiques widened. It was argued, for example, that the conventions of quantitative inquiry led to the theory-ladenness of facts and the underdetermination of theory, and this was seen as problematic. Facts were seen as value-free, which is core to quantitative research, but this was questioned by qualitative research, who argued that facts are instead socially constructed and they're determined by the context in which they emerged. That is, while it may be entirely predictable that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius in the physical sciences, the point at which social phenomena occur is a different kind of fact in the social sciences. So, for example, we already know that social environment has a great deal to do with educational success. But it's impossible to predict exactly the degree to which that fact will become reality, if at all, in all cases, based on socioeconomic climate, based on individual cases within that climate. There are just so many variables within the situation that we can't predict with any kind of certitude. So facts, and here we can start putting quotation marks around that word, within a qualitative paradigm must be examined very differently and cannot be predicted and then verified or generalized. Okay, I'm going to move along quickly from here and consider the outline. Okay, so Guba and Lincoln then consider this question. What is the nature of paradigms and what do we know about them? That is, what do we know with some certainty about their ontology, epistemology, and methodology? So before considering the 4 dominant research paradigms in education, they raise some caveats. They are not open to proof, that is, one is better than the other one. They're more like apples and oranges. None are better or worse, just different and useful in different contexts and circumstances. The closest we can come to put them to the test in terms of how well informed their proponents are and how worthy and sophisticated their arguments are in support of their paradigm of choice. They are dependent on human constructions that are the means of coming to an understanding of the world in which we live, and sometimes of the world beyond our usual boundaries, and must rely on how persuasive and useful the ontology, epistemology, and methodology are in support of the research findings. As a researcher, we have to be able to defend the choices we have made in exploring the particular questions we have identified in our research within a particular paradigm. Does it best support researching what I have identified that I wish to explore in my research? And that's the kind of question, for example, that you'd be asked in your examination, your oral examination for a thesis defense for your doctorate or your master's. There are 4 main or major theoretical approaches to qualitative analysis. Positivism, that is, inquiry that relies on observation and quantifiable analysis to determine reality. Post-positivism, which comes out of positivism and recognizes that truth is fallible and cannot be verified in any final sense. So in the social sciences, this opens up greater opportunities for more contextual analysis. And Ryan talks about that. Critical theory, which has as its goal emancipation from social norms that limit fair opportunities for all. Postmodernism and post-structuralism can be, arguably, seen as related to critical theory, if emancipatory, but may arguably be seen as outside conventional theory as well. And Ryan talks about them quite separately, whereas Guba and Lincoln kind of scoop them together with critical theory. So I think theoretical understandings have progressed since the time of Guba and Lincoln to some degree. And constructivism or naturalism comes out of interpretivist philosophical traditions that may be emancipatory, but are focused primarily on understanding what is and are, in that sense, ontological. So all of these have particular ontologies, epistemologies, and methodologies, and Guba and Lincoln go through that in significant detail. In the rest of the paper, they explore intra-paradigm analysis. That is, they look at both the basic beliefs of received and alternative paradigms. Then they look at them a cross-disciplinary way, as well as an internal analysis, looking at them kind of more, what is that, vertically. Implications of each paradigm's position on selected practical issues. So this raises questions like, what is the nature of knowledge? How is a body of knowledge constructed? What criteria for judging goodness or quality of inquiry are appropriate? What's the role of values, ethics? What's the place of voice? What about novice inquirers, and what do we do without a lot of experience? How do we make judgments about the validity of the research? Are paradigms in conflict with one another? Which is most influential, and so on. So, that's they do a lot in this paper, and we're pretty well done with talking about them in this video, but of course there's a great deal more detail in the paper itself. So I'd encourage you to wade your way through it, get out of it what you can, and maybe wade your way through it again if you have the stomach for that, and get out of it what you can again, and then it will be a paper that you will go back to, I think, as you come to different papers and concepts, and just see what this paper has to say about particular aspects of the whole process of research itself. It's without a doubt a challenging read, and not one that I at least entirely understand to this day, but it introduces key concepts in establishing the theoretical and paradigmatic grounding in research, and is an excellent resource to return to. While Robertson, particularly in his first video, and Ryan reinforced some of the concepts in more approachable language, but conceptually every bit as rich. As always, if you have questions about the readings or the assignments, I'm an email away, and I invite you to ask me any questions that you wish, or if I can clarify anything for you, and I'm able to, I will. So all the best. By the end of this module, you're going to be halfway through this course, believe it or not. And so I wish you well as you make your way through this. And as I said, you're more than welcome to raise any questions you wish to. All the best. Okay.